各位观众，大家好，欢迎收看华尔街电视，我是节目主持人孙昌国。今天特别为各位观众邀请到了以色列特拉维夫大学荣誉教授 Aron Shai， 为我们讨论以色列在中美角力下会做出什么抉择，决策形成背后考量的重点是什么。Aron 教授在以色列是非常有名的中国专家，著作等身。今天非常荣幸能邀请他来上华尔街的节目。Professor Aron, it's an honor to have you here. How will you describe the current relationship between China and Israel? What are the factors influencing the relationship and why?
Okay, thank you very much for interviewing me. Yes, I think the relations between China and Israel are very good, and they go quite smoothly. However, I think that due to the COVID-19 and the difficulties we had in the past 2 years, moving and communicating between the two countries, the relations were not as intensive as they used to be 2 years ago. So we have had some problems with the ambassadors moving from one country to the other. And I hope, and I think that at the moment, the Chinese ambassador to Israel is located in Beijing for a while for a certain course or, I don't know, consultations. But on the whole, I think relations are very good when we talk about trade, cultural relations, and so on and so forth, not to mention, of course, Chinese investments in Israel, which are going quite smoothly and nice. But again, I would say that I hope that in the next year, things will go back to normal.
All right. Nice to hear from you. Professor, China's relation with Israel, as far as I know, has to be based on pragmatic and non-political stance. As both countries had other countries' factors to consider, China had to manage and stay out of the Middle Eastern conflict. Israel has to consider United States' interest in the region. To you, how can you avoid choosing sides?
Yes, I'll tell you the truth. Frankly, I think it is very, very difficult to separate pragmatism from political issues, because very much, when you go ahead and you act and you practice, you have to bring into consideration, whether you want it or not, you have to bring political considerations as well, because China has its own political considerations and interests in the Middle East. And I will go deeper into that in a minute. And then, of course, Israel has its own, as you said yourself, political problems, not only inside domestic problems, but it also has some political or diplomatic problems relating to the triangle between United States, Israel, and China. So in fact, it's very, very difficult to separate, because we are not talking about two companies or two individuals conducting commercial relations. When you deal with countries, you have to bring into the picture the political consideration as well. Now, if you want, I can expand and elaborate more, but depends on your...
Yes, please, Professor, elaborate it more.
Yes, I think, for example, that you see China as an academic, as a professor who has been dealing with China in the past 50 years or so, China has its own interests. And at the moment, it's very interesting because politically speaking, diplomatically speaking, China goes along with the Arab world and with the Palestinians, and you can check it and examine this thing when you consider China's behavior, so to speak, in the United Nations. So whenever there is a problem,
it's okay.
a debate in the UN, so quite automatically, I would say, Beijing actually conducts a policy which is very, very pro-Arab, shall we say, or pro-Palestinian. So in fact, if you check for the very long stretch of time, you will see that consistently China goes with the Arab capitals and the Arab governments. There is no question about it, no question. Now, on the other hand, and it is much more important as far as I'm concerned, when you talk about trade, when you talk about technology, when you talk about academic and scientific relations, when you talk about inventions, innovations, and all these things, certainly we do not see Chinese delegations go to Amman or to Damascus or to Beirut. I mean, if they want really to deal with the front and the frontier of medicine, for example, they don't go to Beirut, that's quite clear. They don't go to Damascus. So you have hundreds and hundreds of delegations, Chinese delegations, come to Israel, to the universities, to cyber centers, to nanotechnology, to medical, to hospitals and everything in Israel. They do not go to Arab countries. I mean, the Arab countries around us. But as I said, when there are discussions in the UN or various international organizations, the Chinese representatives automatically, it doesn't matter what the issue is, automatically, they never consider the Israeli position. So it's a two-pronged, so to speak, attitude, and this is very interesting. So what actually happened a few weeks ago is that for the first time, and Israel always goes along with China. I mean, I can mention, of course, the fact that Israel was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the PRC, the People's Republic of China, after 100 days that the PRC was proclaimed in January 1950. So you cannot find many countries who recognize Beijing and the new government in January of 1950. And even when, in the long run, there were no diplomatic relations between China and Israel, Israel consistently voted for China to be a member, a full member in the UN and of course, the Security Council. So this is a paradox, and there is a certain tension here, if you see what I mean. And a few weeks ago, for the first time ever, Israel joined a group of 40 countries who voted in the Human Rights Committee of the UN against China for the first time. But China, as I said, voted against Israel hundreds of times. So this is a paradox. And if I were Chinese, I would be very proud of this policy because it's very clever. 很聪明, 很聪明, you say in Chinese. In other words, you get the best out of two worlds. You get the best out of the diplomatic and political world, and you get the best out of the scientific, academic, and etc. And trade from Israel. So this
Professor,
is very, very interesting.
Yes. Please continue.
Now, the decision by Israel to vote against China, or let's say for the resolutions that United States and Canada actually brought about in the UN, this was in fact due to two factors. One is pressure by Canada and the United States on Israel to change the current situation and join them when it deals with, problematic questions concerning Xinjiang and other problems that we know. So the Chinese government, I think, was a little bit disappointed. And I understand Beijing, because I understand the Chinese quite well, I think. Dealing with China, as I said, for over 50 years. I'm not Chinese, but I've written 8 books about China, and I've visited China many, many times and lectured there. So I understand the attitude of both countries. Now, another thing I think has to do with something which is not necessarily only Israeli. As you know, there are some doubts and there are some anxieties concerning the Belt and Road, and also Chinese investments and involvement in various economies. And again, as a professor and as an academic, I see both sides of the coin. In other words, I see that on the one hand, and certainly Israel, they want really, they want investments, they want foreign investments, and they want foreign investments, and China is doing quite well in this respect. However, at the same time, there are some anxieties as to whether we do not actually volunteer to give some scientific and knowledgeable information to the Chinese, who get it either by paying or by buying or purchasing Israeli companies, which are very advanced technologically speaking, you see. And also, there is a problem, and again, it's not only in Israel, it can be in Italy and Portugal and Germany and so on, even in Eastern Europe. So in other words, what I think we see here is, on the one hand, interest in Chinese investments. On the other hand, a certain anxiety to do with how much China would be involved in domestic or internal politics and economies. So when you talk about national infrastructure, for example, and the latest one had to do with the Haifa port.
Yes, Professor, you are correct to point out Haifa port.
Yes.
Because as far as I know, that the U.S. was very concerned about it, and even intervened, negotiate with the Israeli government. Can you talk more about it?
Yes. I think that, you see, we are doing very well economically and financially. Israel is not a backward country. It's very advanced. It doesn't belong to the third world. And therefore, it can pay for some projects. But there are some projects which we need Chinese expertise. Let's say when we talk about tunnels, when we do talk about the light trains in Tel Aviv area, we don't know how to do it. The Chinese know how to do it. And also when we talk about the Haifa port, you see, the Chinese have done fantastic job there when you talk about technology, engineering, and so on. However, and you see, every problem that I raise here, or you raise, has two sides, sort of Janus face, as they say in the mythology, because you have the upside and you have the downside. Now, as far as Haifa port is concerned, they've done a fantastic job, and they can bring, the most advanced ships and containers, that we never dreamt of. However, there is the following problem. Let's say if the Chinese are entrenched in the Haifa area or region, and in the port, of course, the question is, if there is an emergency or a state of war in the area, and diplomatic tensions or what have you between Israel and Iran, let's take this as an example. The question is, how would the Chinese actually, and I'm talking about the PRC, of course, how would the Chinese tackle this problem? Let's say I give you something imaginary, totally imaginary, but it can happen. Let's say they have a concession, the Chinese, in the Haifa area, an airport, and they've got it until, if I'm not mistaken, 2046, because they got it in just a month ago. They got it for 25 years. Now, let's say that in 10 years, in 15 years, whenever you want, there is a tension and there is a very, very disquieting tension between Israel and Iran, as everybody knows. Let's say the Iranians press the Chinese government not to go along with Israel, let's say, imports to Israel, exports, but let's say even imports when we need various material, in other words, whether these are military or civil. The question is, and this is something that worries the people here in Israel, because on the whole, the control over the port is Israeli control. The Chinese have a certain section there which operates the port. But then again, there is a fear. And let's take another project which we talk about very theoretically, but it is possible in a few years' time. Let's say the railway from Eilat, the southern port of Israel, to the center of Israel, let's say Ashdod port, which lies on the Mediterranean Sea. So in fact, if you have a good railway from the south to the center, or in other words, from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, it's a sort of a continental bridge, which the Chinese are very interested in. Now, we cannot, by no means can we actually construct and go ahead with such a project. We don't have the expertise, we don't have the finances, and if the Chinese get the concession and get the permission to go ahead with that, then there are various problems. One problem that we can face is problem with the Egyptians, because they might see this continental bridge as a sort of competition with the Suez Canal. And secondly, again, there is a problem that if they get it, let's say it takes them about 10 years or 7 years to construct, and then about 30 years as sort of concession for this operating this railway. So we are talking about around 35 or 40 years, and the Chinese will be entrenched in the very middle of Israel. Now, again, if there is tension or war, we have had quite a few wars in the area between Israel and the Arab world, or even worse, between Iran and Israel, again, the same dilemma will arise. How would we tackle this problem? And this is a very, very serious problem because the Chinese will face a dilemma. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm glad you brought up the Iran issue. I think it is very important because as far as I know that China has signed a deal with Iran for at least 30 years. It's very comprehensive cooperation accord. So what's the general opinion in Israel about this?
Israel, official Israel, is very, very worried about Iran. No matter what government we have here, they all think that Iran is strategic threat, strategic danger to the very existence of Israel. Because in the case of Iran, we are not talking about border disputes or any other disputes that any other country may have. We are talking about the only country in the world which says, there are many organizations, extreme organizations, but as far as countries are concerned, this is the only country which says that Israel should not exist at all. So in fact, you cannot compromise. You see, there are no issues which should be dealt with or that we can accommodate or compromise with or whatever. We are talking about the very existence of Israel. Now, Israel is very worried, as you know, about the nuclear capability of Iran and to what extent it can develop this capability and bring about and actually practice in a situation that may arise. To what extent can it actually send missiles or even nuclear missiles into Israel? So there is a certain trauma here which one has to tackle. Of course, there are those who say that perhaps the Iranians exaggerate and they don't have this capability, because we have seen in the past few years that some strategists were saying, that within half a year or within a year, Iran will have this capability. But at the moment, they do not. But they advance very nicely. And as you said, the relations between Iran and China are really almost perfect. I mean, there are common interests, and they have signed this treaty.
Mutually beneficial.
And it's very complex.